I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in art writing here at the School of Visual Arts. Now accepting applications for next year. Welcome to the latest installment of our Quixote Talks series, which consists of pointed talks and discussions about relevant pasts and possible futures. Tonight we're pleased to have poet, performer, educator, and activist Ann Waldman here to talk about her experiences as a member of the New York School, a loosely affiliated group of artists and writers who lived and worked in New York City in the mid-20th century. The group and its achievements were recently celebrated in the book New York School Painters and Poets, Neon and Daylight, published last year by Rizzoli. This is the book, and we're not, rather than showing digital slides, we're just going to hold up books all night. One of the frontispiece photographs of Edwin Denby sitting on a roof was taken right there, right across the street. So it's all come home. Anne was, of course, not born when this photograph was taken. In 1937, and she was a child when she was part of the New York School, but she was right in the center of the second generation, and maybe you can talk about how that happened. The New York School is not only a historical subject, it's a model for what can happen when a few writers and artists get together as friends to work and play and change the world, and they did. I've known Anne as a friend for many years now, and she's been constant good company, as Robert Creeley would say, for all that time, and an inspiration for her tireless embodiment of poetry, political activism, and spiritual practice. Anne is a co-founder with Allen Ginsberg of the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at Naropa University in Boulder, where she is a distinguished professor of poetics and artistic director of the summer writing program. She's also the former director of the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, which she helped establish in 1966. She's an outrider. Allen Ginsberg called her his spiritual wife. She was in Bob Dylan's film Ronaldo and Clara and was part of that caravan. She was arrested at Rocky Flats. She's the author of more than 40 books of poetry, including the book-length poem Manatee Humanity, the feminist epic, the Yovis Trilogy, Colors in the Mechanism of Concealment, and the forthcoming Voices Daughter of a Heart Yet to be Born. Her archive of correspondence with Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Robert Creeley, Diane DePrima, one of my principal teachers, and many others is at the University of Michigan's library at Ann Arbor. Our student, Blessy Augustine, interviewed Anne for SVA Close-Up this week, and one of the things Anne said was, poetry and painting relate because they both want to wake the world up to itself. Friendship was always important in the New York School ethics, the mind moving between two artists and art forms and the third mind emerging. Speaking of the third mind, I hope many of you will join us here tomorrow for our annual Critical Information Conference on Text and Image from 12 noon to 6 p.m. with a full complement of speakers and panels. Ask me about it later. Please welcome Ann Waldman.
Thank you so much, Levi. It's so great to be here. And I spent time in that apartment across the street, happy to say. Quite a few hours over the years with Edwin. Good to see you all here. It's an honor to come to this class and this program with the indefatigable Levi. An inspiration to me, too. So, I have a couple of things. I have some notes here, and I did want to start with, let's see, I need to lead things off. This poem I wrote when Jane Freilacher died. Do some of you know who Jane Freilacher was? Wonderful. And this was thinking back to the earlier days. It's called Nostalgia for Jane Freilacher. To you, Muse, who rocked the brains of so many of my heroes. You, a hero too, for wise quip, bon mot, and panoramic eye, and stand up all around beauty enters the room, our own Barbara Stanwyck. Glamorous, slender, assured, always gracious, if not a bit impatient. Why aren't these people wittier? Perky word monger, wonder, figure of a liberated tongue, not miss a beat, voice distinct in the ear. It was your classy parties with drink and din, kinetics of best talk in town. Morris, Barbara, John, Yvonne, Alex, Joe LeSueur, Kiniston, Rudy, Red, Ada, Ned, Larry, Harry, Mimi, Maxine, Kenneth, Smile, hubby Joe's hospitality, but always a bit of intimidation round you with your aura. Those staggeringly great poems writ in your honor, bunkering the head, you turn crazy Jane of poetic trope into upscale, glowing, modish, madcap Jane, legendary gossip's elegance mounting around you, star, la Freilacher. Formidable, and by contrast, although you were never loud, the quietest paintings, as if noise forever absent or transmuted into compressed tension, and arrangement transfer was perfectly natural. John Ashbery calls tentative. Could we dare say egoless in this tribute? Spaces between objects come onto this window ledge, this table, center of the world, a hearth to mute, a button on the roar. Hush here before your stroke and palette. Can't thank you enough, ingenious painter, for these and continuity, but back, come back again. Can't get enough of the parties of yesteryear. Terrific Fifth Avenue apartments, readiness, gleam of us shining too. Happy to be in your realm a moment. And Jimmy showing up in what Kenward called his lub period, with biker chains around his neck, and Joe Brainerd, lanky, innocently loose, and people still smoked. I remember being haunted indelibly. How get so lucky to be here? High tone in that inimitable talk again will never be the same in purgatorial New York. Caught on time spiral, Jane, helping many of us late arrivistes enter the Academy of the New York School Future, which opened its doors to us. I have this thing I'll dip into that I wrote actually with this in mind, a kind of tribute to Frank O'Hara and Second Avenue, kind of weaves in some response there and some history. But I'm going to start with these notes inside the New York School rhizome. When I first met Frank O'Hara in 1965, he suggested I come work as an intern at MoMA. Sadly, I couldn't afford to do that just out of college, but I got a job as an assistant with the newly conceived arts projects based at St. Mark's Church, 10th Street and 2nd Avenue, second oldest parish in New York after Trinity. A grant from Lyndon Johnson's Office of Economic Opportunity started up in the fall of 1966, and this grant was to benefit alienated youth on the Lower East Side. And there were some. But Frank O'Hara's death was a kind of trigger. He died that summer prior to the beginning of the poetry project, although we had been in the space using the parish hall for readings, for open readings. Paul Blackburn oversaw those, and he would lug his giant Wallensack recorder. So there's a record and some history of that time and recordings from the early years, which are pretty great. But in any case, it officially started, the Poetry Project officially started in '66, along with the Millennium Film Project and the Theater Genesis, which I think some of their first productions were plays by Sam Shepard and others. In any case, Frank O'Hara's death was a kind of trigger. Something of him went into a lot of us. And don't let it die. I want to speak from the heart, from experience, and from a mapping of a life in poetry around painters as well, various kinds of visual artists, and in artistic community and collaboration that began quite early for me and extends to this day. I mean, in Jenny Quilter's introduction to this book, she talks, I think, referencing mainly John Ashbery and others who kind of moved out, as they became more known and famous and so on, moved out of the this sort of space of what had been more like a coterie, although that's not quite the word, but that's a word that's been applied. And I like to think in terms of the rhizome of a certain continuity that's held and continues through various inheritors like Vincent Katz here and others and people I'm continuing to work and collaborate with. So, and I was recently at a BEAT conference in Brussels, and this same sort of feeling of, this endless, not only the discovery and kind of reclaiming of texts and things, there's lots that's still hidden or unknown or all kinds of things still to come to the surface. But as Amiri Baraka said to me before he died, don't let it get buried. So there's a lot of work that goes on, certainly with this situation here with Art Critical, the work you people do, and also with Amiel Alkali's Lost and Found. So, a sense of the continuity of looking at the work. Often it takes, 50 years for people to start paying attention. So, speaking of this map, collaboration extends to this day, and I find it continually working as a powerful antidote to samsara, providing a panoramic view and imagination through refreshed language, through creative juxtaposition, through a liberated sense perception in the service of art, a poesis, the origin of the word poetry, a making, as well as a kind of strength or armor or shelter to an increasingly disturbing vision of reality that could only be guessed at. I think when we were first starting out, not really, we weren't that naive, but we're so caught up with various liberating and political work in the 60s, and to see, things in these, as that rhizome continues, and we're all interconnected in this, but these, darker times. And one of I think the issues is how to look into that darkness and not be paralyzed. So, and no surprise in terms of how things seem to go, this complicated karma of, colonialism, the warring God realm, sell weaponry to your enemies so you can have a war. I grew up on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village, lived there all my life, still have a room and with trips and periods of time living in Boulder, Colorado, where we founded the Jack Kerouac School in 1974. But I still have a room on McDougal and work there. My father had been in World War II, and I knew people whose families had perished in the camps. I was taking shelter under my desk at Public School 8 on King Street, clutching a little metal dog tag, wondering how this could save me or identify me if there were a nuclear bomb, or protect us from the commies who might be coming across the great waters. Surely it would disintegrate in a nuclear holocaust. I knew that much. And so what saved me in a way was this cognitive dissonance. And I think, I experienced that realization that we all do at some point, that this in this particular situation made no sense, that the people in charge, the teachers, the parents were scared too. And you experience this, it's very palpable. And, I think this turned me toward a life more in the imagination and in community, and made me an artist, and some others I think of. So coming early onto and into the work and persons of the New York School Nexus at age 20 was one of the most auspicious and great blessings. I consider it to be a great blessing in my life, because it exposed me to a way of life in poetry, to a conversation, to a library. And an aside here, the Chaldean sense of chaos meant without a library, so a library is very important. And friendships and in poetry and painting, they continue to thrive with certain people who are thankfully still among us. And then there's also the ongoing conversation, and a certain kind of work continues. I'm still in conversation with Joe Brainerd, certainly. So, there's a struggle and a practice and all that. And I was going to list various younger people who are still continuing the work, but we'll get to that later. So it was playful, it was deep. This nexus had a spiritual dimension, and it wasn't a denial of anything to do with life. It was life. This was our life. And I think that sense of cognitive dissonance. I also felt it, particularly around Kenneth Koch, who I traveled with, this sort of wanting to live in another realm. And I mean, I think we all do that in these various ways. But a certain kind of spontaneity and willingness to play. Having been in Paris just over a week ago on a panel discussing ecofeminism and my experiences with Rocky Flats, the site in Colorado, 10 miles downwind from Naropa University, where until relatively recently plutonium was being brought in for the triggers that were produced there for nuclear warheads, suddenly, one felt the vulnerability all over again. And we've recently acquired the papers of Joanna Macy, who's a very important anti-nuke activist, and has a lot of proposals for how we should work in areas of containment. And this Rocky Flats was, of course, one of the most deadly sites. So something that's always hovering on our margins. Here we were creating the program out there, and yet, with this horrible monster quite nearby. And then I was thinking about Beirut, and Mahmoud Darwish's account in his brilliant memoir. I'm sure many of you know A Memory for Forgetfulness, an account of being trapped while under siege of war. And I thought once again of this notion of how we look into the darkness and how we are contemporary with our time, and a sense of how can that be a generative time? How can we not be paralyzed and live living in either complacency or fear all the time? So the sustaining early years of poetry in community, as Levi referenced, the company of friends, Creeley's term, how the work happening around me was so familial in a way, and really smart, unconditional, unpresumed, deeply, part of my existence. It established a kind of standard how one might respond to any situation, with candor, with wit, with repartee, with a heightened language, with spontaneity, with images and conversations, with dream. I remember I first was out in Boulder and teaching. I would get accused of being too New York school because I was a little too, critical and trying to be humorous, but so there was, style. I remember Kenneth at a benefit for Oxfam reading a poem which is essentially about himself, I Am Kenneth Koch in Africa, which was, a little brave, kind of charming, solipsistic, but, traveling with him, going to, and, sometimes the New York school is seen as not particularly political, and I think, as I was maturing with a certain kind of work, and of course very close to Allen Ginsberg, and kind of drawn into, political work that involved being around him as well, and sort of cultural political work, cultural activism, I would call it. But I was drawn in a way to a more public sort of demonstration and bringing things into public space. And there was, when sometimes Kenneth would read, I'm just using his as an example because I don't know that John Ashbery was traveling. When was that? This was a little later, maybe the late 70s. And Jimmy never read publicly. James Schuyler didn't read much. Barbara was a little more active, but wasn't traveling in that way. Of course, Frank had died. But in any case, going to East Berlin, through Checkpoint Charlie, everyone wearing their Macintoshes. We sat in these folding chairs. Again, listening to Czech opera. And I was recently traveling with Ron Padgett in China. And again, everything's an adventure. So I want to say everything with the New York School of Poets is an adventure. You get a chance to travel with them. I mean, I was with Ron just, recently. And this kind of, very surreal, like a surreal poem with ceremonies at a Confucius temple, yellow scarves around our neck, waiting for hours in the sun, bowing and bowing, a lot of contradictions because you're, of course, in secular China. And as we approach the main temple with huge statues of Confucius, there was a whole tray of severed heads, animal heads. It was very much like a Hindu Hindu temple. So that kind of syncretic style. Anyway, that's an aside. So just talking now about going to China. Okay. How I was thinking of being pulled off a train for 20 minutes with the guide bleu to look at the Durham Cathedral, the sense of wanting to be met at the stations of the towns we were going to read in, meet us with a brass band, the circus is coming to town, and so on. Anyway, the world that this tome, Neon in Daylight, so magnanimously portrays is very vital, sort of captures this energy, this high energy construct, which is a term from Olson, but it certainly applies here, and the kinetics of the thing, as he calls it, these people up against one another and in it together. So coming to this relatively early, already swayed by poetry, not thinking of it as a career, growing up in this Greenwich Village environment, and there was nothing, quite like this early freedom and exposure in this kind of literary nexus. And I had come out of Bennington College and, working with Howard Nemoff, a completely other reality. Who, we couldn't talk about Gertrude Stein. She was silly. And it was kind of a boys' club. There'd be these visits from various poets. Ginsberg, of course, was anathema. The left-hand margin, verse culture, content-driven. And so the New York School coming, quickly into that temporary autonomous zone, in Hakim Bey's phrase, was this non-institutional nexus, was a very different kind of citizenship. You all know the term rhizome from Deleuze and Guattari. The rhizome resists, just paraphrasing, resists the organizational structure of the root tree system, which charts causality along chronological lines, looks for the original source of things, and looks towards the conclusion of these things. But a rhizome is characterized by these established connections, these chains, these organizations of power and circumstance relative to arts and social struggles. And rather than a narrativizing history and culture, the rhizome presents the culture and history as a map, a wide array of attractions. And it has no beginning or end. It's always in the middle, between things, intermezzo. And the planner movement resists, as I said, this organization. And there's a more nomadic system of growth and propagation. So this idea of the middle of things, to suddenly drop into this scene that's already, very non-hierarchical and not particularly organized, incredibly, social. And I only met Frank O'Hara twice, but and this was shortly before he died. So as Levi was saying, I was coming into this later situation. I don't know if you've all seen the photo in the book of the two schools. You have the first generation New York school out at Watermill with their tans and kind of, I have it here, I'll pass it around. And then you have the, our little community with, in a park in Staten Island with a lot of children and sunglasses and no martinis, or Negronis, that was Frank O'Hara's drink. Anyway, it's in here. Oh no, this is not my book. Anyway, there's a wonderful, very telling photo of the, the style and the difference. And I always think of the Robert Lowell line, "Tamed by Milltown, we lie on mother's bed." I remember thinking, that is not the drug of our generation. And, this is referenced a little in the book, that there was a shift, marijuana, smoking, downtown scene, caught up with more political things, as I said, taking things into public space. And by '66, of course, the Poetry Project had started. There was a lot of people coming in through that door, and a lot of poets from all over, and poets affiliated with the new American poetry and beyond, these different schools. I'm not sure how much of the students here have studied all that stuff. I would assume you sort of, a little bit. but you had, of course, Robert Duncan and Spicer and Blazer in San Francisco, and you had the Black Mountain, sort of nexus, and the San Francisco, that was the Renaissance, and then Black Mountain, and then the New York School and the Beats, and various other affiliates. And you also had the Black Arts movement, and then later Umbra and some of those. And there were a lot of overlappings, overlaps between many of the individuals. Ginsberg was quite close to Frank, and of course to Amiri. Amiri had a period where he was more affiliated with the beat writers, and these are useful terms, I think, but they don't really define the complexity of the rhizome with these individual, from romances to kind of work to a certain repartee of ideas and high talk, as Alan characterized it. And so this, the correspondences, I think, are very important and will be, further revealed. But anyway, that shift around the 66, as I said, I felt that some of, they talk about the sparagmos and the deity and the parts of the deity coming into, a larger space. Or there's a Buddhist view of when somebody dying, that something is released. And one felt that we were very, very energized in those early years with the project, certainly. And there was a sense of, and Edwin Demby was there at every reading and complaining about the sound in the church, but also saying that it didn't matter because you picked up on the atmosphere, and that was very important. Couldn't quite hear. The church had been built for, a minister to stand in a particular part of the room, and unless it was, and it never works really that well, even being mic'd. But we also were in the more intimate parish hall. But there's, incredible, it's almost 50 years now, documents and records of a lot of those events and readings. And I'd say the, nexus for me was the so-called second generation. And Ted Berrigan, of course, was a very important figure in all that, and kind of was a sort of messenger, in a way, to the older scene. I mean, his great love for Frank O'Hara was, constantly with him. We got to go to a lot of the, the parties and some of the more uptown scenes. There were, terrific open gallery openings. Lita Hornick's famous parties with the Pinkerton Men, and she had a pretty great art collection. So that was there were these places where you'd meet socially, which were very important. And the artists' lofts, that was a big deal. Parties at Oldenburg's or Larry Rivers. So that this maybe it's still going on. Somebody has to tell me. I haven't seen any. Jim, I remember when Rosenquist sent out a invitation, just something about come have old faces meet new faces. Big loft party. There were lots of ways. I mean, I met people who I was later to work with at Naropa from dance worlds, and Barbara Dilley, who was with Merce Cunningham, and again, Cage was in the mix. The Living Theater, many of the most exciting things that were going on at that time, and continued in their various ways. But it felt that they were closer and in closer relation, and it was more casual. You could visit an artist's studio and sit there, have a conversation. You could walk in you didn't have to arrange anything often prior to visiting, and you'd sometimes walk in and a collaboration would start, certainly with Joe Brainerd or George Schneeman. This is a little bit later. Donna Dennis, Elizabeth Murray, and think of others as well. With Alex Katz, one would be invited in to sit and pose, and that was always an amazing conversation with him and watching how he worked. Trying to think of other good examples, but since later things became more codified, I didn't feel that I'm not going to say anything bad about contemporary artists. But are they reading poetry? These people were really reading poetry and coming to readings, and I think really attentive in a way, and incredibly supportive. I mean, I couldn't have moved to Colorado and set up a little scene there without a work from Philip Guston. So, that's sort of, and Edwin, of course, talks about that. Edwin and Rudy Burkhardt, because of their friendship with de Kooning, were able to, support themselves and continue through owning works of his, and that sort of thing. So this kind of generosity, more of a flow, was going on there. Okay, I'm not going to go on more about the rhizome. So, I was going to say something about surface, and there's this idea from Guattari, culture spreading like the surface of a body of water, spreading towards available spaces, trickling downwards spaces. The surface, on and on about the surface, can be interrupted and move. The disturbances leave no trace. Water is charged with pressure. And I think of Alex Katz's work, and to some extent, George and Joe, this, paintings exemplify this kind of magical surface quality, and the surface as a positive in its equilibrium, and there's this kind of smooth space, but a lot going on underneath, and it's never shallow. It's very, and of course, the color and the shape is so important. Okay, so just to define this sense of a school being more of a state of mind, an attitude, a social nexus, as I was saying, a reference point, and clearly more than a movement. So one didn't think of the New York School as a movement. Again, camaraderie, artistic collaboration, and then a real resistance and almost belligerence to the establishment, which was very refreshing. And the literary mafias of New York and elsewhere were key. So there was a resistance to, and a kind of, it wasn't indifferent, and one felt informed, certainly informed. I mean, I started using the term outrider when we founded Naropa. It just seemed like a very handy term. You weren't an outsider, you weren't, avoiding anything, but you were outside this kind of mainstream. So just to continue a few, New York School tropes, again, the poesis, this emphasis on the making and the kind of delight of that, and certainly in collaboration, as you could walk into a space and, somebody pulls out some Arches paper, and there's, Joe Brainerd used to have piles of things organized by color, different images, and cut out things and things that he had done himself and then, cut up, and these were available to you to make something with. And then cut up strategies, and the strategies of Oulipo, the Oulipo movement, which has resonance with the New York School, principally in one thinks of Harry Matthews. Maybe some of you know his work, his novels, and some of his strategies in writing, and was a friend and part of that group. And rather than this notion of everything being channeled, channeled the high epiphanic moment, you're waiting for the poem, it's going to arrive, and you wait and wait and wait and wait. So, there's an alternative practice there. Amusement as a kind of ethos. Amusement, be amused, be amusing. O'Hara used this word a lot. You see this in the book. You'll see, this sense of just even those small, there are a lot of sort of home photos, little snapshots, and everybody looks very amused. There's a pleasure and practice of amusement. The poem and the work, some like the collaboration that O'Hara and Larry Rivers do, the Stones collaboration, which is featured in a large way in this book, it's kind of allowed to chronicle the history of its own making. And then also the trajectory of your thought could be the subject of the poem. So again, you're not channeling around a particular subject. There's no closure necessary, really. There's a resistance to closure. Again, very refreshing. So, and also rather than this outside theme, which is something you find more in official verse culture, which is the term Charles Bernstein uses, very handy. The poems can meander and shift and turn, and there's a kind of adventure, rarely a straight narrative line. And, just thinking of some of the longer poems of Ashbery, Paget, Kenneth Koch, there's this walking around quality form a la Apollinaire and Frank O'Hara, who did walk around, and the famous story of him typing on the Olivetti machines on Fifth Avenue. Think of a collaboration I did with Bill Berkson called Young Manhattan. Vincent and I just completed a collaboration which is on art, a conversation on art, but we're also walking around and walking into galleries and conversing. Then you have, open form, composition by field, which is something of course, Charles Olson and others were onto and originating. Of course, you could say it's like the Mallarmé's, radical intervention of coup de day. And then a parallel to indeterminacy in music and painting, thinking of John Cage in particular, the abstract expressionists. And then, again, this making, and the sense of a continuous present at times, which is Stein's term, and writing, being able to write with others around, which is something O'Hara was famous for being able to do. And there's the video of him at work, and he's on the phone and he's typing, and there's music, and this was something we were doing a lot in my apartment on St. Mark's Place. There were a lot of traffic in and out, and we'd often be up all night, several typewriters going, interruptions, people coming in and out, and collaborating together, mainly with text, and sometimes with, making these small little matchbook books and collages, and, playing with making. And in my archive at Michigan, there's quite a few of those little handmade items, so that the kind of almost domestic chaos, and you find this in, say, Bernadette Mayer's poems, some of the poems of Alice Notley. There's activity in the poem. TV's on, their voices, their children's voices, there are certain demands going on from that kind of situation. So again, this sense of your domestic space being, I think for the poets, that became your that was your laboratory. We didn't have studios we could also rent and go to. So poetry was also seen as a collaboration with language itself. And, rather than a kind of logic, and not that, it's not semantic. Words still carry their semantic value, as they do with, say, Stein and people who work with cut up, where the grammar can be somewhat askew. But this leads to certain moves, and you're not always at the controls. I mean, the language sort of takes over, and it forces you into these unusual places, and you're abandoning this, need for a kind of logic, a logopoeia, which is the dance of the intellect. That's Pound's term, and that triad of the logopoeia, melopoeia, phanopoeia, the image and the logic and the melody. So, to abandon that kind of logic was, it wasn't, that logic was not always that interesting, and sometimes it didn't work. It could be a mess, but there was a certain clarity would come through in these almost chance operations. And of course, Burroughs was a great hero to many of us for his amazing cut-up work, and the whole idea of the third mind, and the coming out of the surrealists, putting the headlines in a hat. And an important book, I think, early on was the Dada Painters and Poets, the Motherwell book. That was an important tome for second generation. And the Count Korzybski book on science and sanity, which Ted was very enamored of, which basically says, this is not a pipe, this is not a chair, this is the word chair, etc. So on with its list: free association, sound over logic, and the final form, as I said, wasn't important, but an engagement with the medium of language and imagination itself. These decibels are a kind of flagellation, an entity of sound into which one enters and is a part. We children are ashamed of our bodies, terrified eardrum, a palpable transcendent awareness of body and of space, musical instruments called, these are all lines from The Skaters by John Ashbery. I am yesterday, the pigs in their cages. This then is a portion of the subject of this poem, which is in the form of falling snow. So this, way you can build up and then evaporate, and it's very powerful, I think, as a kind of ethics for the poem. And then free, work that was free of heavy mythological, historical references or footnotes like The Wasteland. But I do think that some of the second generation women writers, women my generation, had to rediscover and reclaim this realm, this mythological, historical reference realm, and form a kind of new torque with it, reevaluate the turf for themselves, as H.D. had done with Helen in Egypt, recalibrating or defining the terms of the masculine narrative. And there was H.D.'s trilogy, which for me was a model of what a war poem might be, and Joanne Kiger's early book, The Tapestry and the Web, which takes on Circe and the pigs and Diane de Prima's goddess poems, and her later Loba, which takes on the she-wolf, Loba the she-wolf. And these, as I mentioned, these other branches of the new American poetry. Certainly Olson has not given up on myth, and there's a whole mythologos study you can do there. And then you had Duncan and Spicer to some extent. But it was bunk to many of the New York School persuasion. You could have these mythic figures in Pollock or recognizable toothy killer hags in de Kooning, but Larry and Jane Freilich, Fairfield Porter, were different ilk. And Joe Brainerd's icon was Nancy from the Ernie Bushmiller cartoon series, not an Electra or a Cassandra. And then there was, Jimmy Scholar was so funny about the White Goddess. Graves, Robert Graves's The White Goddess was a very seminal tome, but Jimmy would refer to the White Goddess as the goddess of tapioca. O'Hara's personism is a mock manifesto, although it perfectly adheres to a practice and an ethos. The poem is set squarely between two persons. This is a phone call. So irony, wit, humor, irreverence, puns, parodies, odd juxtapositions of tenses, pronouns, point of view shifting indiscriminately, and then you had pseudo or mistranslations, and often, there were texts that were being used and played with, a book you might find just randomly and be inspired to white out certain words and construct a new version. So kind of appropriation and collage, montage, the mistranslations, the notion of translating a poem from a language you do not understand, or you could translate English into English. The tennis court oath is still one of my favorite texts, and I think that was very important for many of us when that came out. And of course, Ted Berrigan's sonnets, which are, stolen lines from Rimbaud and Ashbery and others, Shakespeare, a lot from The Tempest, and the way he worked on that. And then there's even one, he says, I've forgotten the exact line, but William Carlos Williams had said, he'd given up on the sonnet. The sonnet, you had to cut off its, it was like a crab, I think, crab. You had to cut off its legs to make it fit. And so this was the gauntlet was thrown to reclaim the sonnet. So that sense of doing, when something, when they were these ultimate pronouncements from the modernists or whoever, or the more official verse culture crowd, there was, I remember thinking when Stein was being so dissed by Howard Nemeroff, I just wanted to immerse myself in Stein and write like her and so on. So this, there's a little bit of this bad boy mentality. Anyway, there's many, many texts that were so important. And then, these methods sometimes were similar across these different, the experimental, these schools I've mentioned, but with very different results. And then there'd be these sort of ad hoc forms, a river in every line, alphabet poems, although I think there were some surrealist versions of those, a kind of anaphoric litany, but very different from, well, maybe not so different. Whitman was, I think, important to all these schools, and then, in a way, and I think our generation came along with the sense of hybrid, of crossing, and delighting in the difference and picking up different vibes. And then again, some of these texts that were important to New York School writers, you had to read Raymond Roussel and Hebdomadus by Chirico, and I mentioned the Dada painters and poets. Let's see, how are we doing on time? When does this class end? 8? Oh God, I can go on and on, but questions? Should we have some questions? Exquisite corpses, parlor games, overheard conversations, what people are saying, mishearing what people are saying, even those right next to you, an ear actually open to mishearing names of friends and family and so on, without discussion or footnote, in-house conversation, and this, again, that sense of in media res, middle of things. And just an aside, I working for Naropa in Indonesia at one point, and we had part of our program in Bali, and there's a term used, the term rame, R-A-M-E, and it has to do with how you behave around funerals. It's not moody, and there's a sense of celebration, not solemn, gloomy occasions. You speak loudly, you gesture to scare off the demons who would love to get into your psyches, create a vulnerable spot to shift your frequency towards some downward spiral, increases their power. So other lists here, instability of meaning or logic, ambiguity, and then if the relationship between word and world and word and concept was just random, then one's attitude toward language had to change. And this, was something I think Clark Coolidge and others shared, and was an agenda or mission kind of around some of the early language experiments. Let's see, talk a little bit about some of the. I wanted to mention Barbara Guest, who was given short shrift in this book. I think that was a little bit dominated by some of my male colleagues. Some of the choices in this book, I can go on about gender and diversity and so on, but it's basically a book about collaboration, about these relationships. So that really defines the terms of the anthology, and it's incredibly inclusive from that perspective. But I feel that Barbara, who did collaborate with Nell Blaine and many of I think Grace Hartigan and others, is not prominent enough for me. But I just wanted to quote her. There is an invisible architecture often supporting the surface of the poem, interrupting the progress of the poem. It reaches into the poem in search for an identity with the poem. Architecture in the period before the poem finds an exact form and vocabulary, before the visible appearance of the poem on the page and the invisible approach to its composition. Reaching out to develop the poem, there are interruptions, some apparently for no reason. Something else is happening, the poet has no control, the poem begins to quiver or hesitate, to become insubstantial. The desire of poetry to elevate itself, to become stronger. The poem is fragile. It needs to reach through the armed vehicle of the poem to loosen the armed hand. She speaks in a late interview of her relationship, because she was interestingly picked up by some of the language poets, some of the younger folk in that whole nexus. And she, in a late interview, she talks about how they were big on Marx. I'm not a Marxist, and on French philosophy, and I'm also not a philosopher. And she speaks of them being more involved with the poetics than the poem. She spoke of humor, of the irony being so much a part of life and her work. So I'll stop there for a moment. I have another little text to share with you, but we'll see if there's time. There's a consistency with her work, her attention to artists, her her responding, I think, to ours in the work itself, and then in her friendships and in these collaborations. So I mentioned, I mean, there were even things coming out late in her life with visual artists, primarily women. So I think, yes, I don't know if men are more apt. I mean, I feel very up to jumping in. And I know a few others. I know Alex doesn't like to collaborate much. There's a, and Allen Ginsberg always had a little trouble with, well, any kind of appropriation, but also he did work with, he did work later with, Clementi and other artists of, it was in the last decade or so of his life. He was doing more of those kinds of collaboration. But, there's I wouldn't say that men are more apt, or sorry. But, there's a Buddhist slogan, Dharma gates are endless, I vow to enter every one of them. And one of my Buddhist teachers said to a group of his students, it'll be your job to take Buddhism back to China. I mean, I have no such megalomaniacal fantasies, but every time I go, I'm around young people. My first trip, this next trip, I think is my fourth trip. My first trip was very scripted, and I was censored. I had a text that talked about the founding of Naropa, and anything, mentioning Tibetan Buddhism, et cetera, was excised. I think it was excised from my biography. But it was at that was maybe 8 years ago. And then another trip, which was run by a private, sort of not an official government university, sponsored by the government, was more, the whole point was to have conversations with Chinese writers, and it was much more private and smaller, and we traveled around a lot together and went to Yellow Mountain. And then meeting young people who were very interested in the West. We're just discovering Frank O'Hara. That was like 7 years ago. I mean, you have to remember there was this, as this black hole, and then there's this sort of catching up. But the couple of the conferences I've gone to have been, very good, looking at Pound and all Pound's references to Chinese painting in the cantos, and very smart presentations. In Wuhan, there were young Chinese scholars studying the objectivists and saying things like, I love the Jewish diaspora. And, reading Charles Reznikoff. I mean, who is reading Charles Reznikoff here except, people in our worlds, or Carl Rakosi, or Lorene Niedecker. They hadn't gotten to Lorene Niedecker, actually. I told them about that. But, and then, at the same time, you'll go to a restaurant and they want you to try the Mao fish, because Mao frequently came to Wuhan and would swim across the Yangtze, and there was a famous fish dish. So, there are contradictions. And I try to be available. And this last trip with Ron was to Yunnan, and we were in Kunming. And again, seeing a lot of students, younger people who are also photographers, and young women involved with fashion. I feel like the women are very, getting quite liberated there. So it's an opportunity. It's like missionary work. There was a sense then of, Alex, for example, who still reads poetry, and you're with painters who are talking to you about your poetry, or about poetry or a book, or turning you on to something. I just don't. But there's less. I mean, I've worked with Richard Tuttle, and I've worked with Elizabeth Murray, who, of course, they're both readers of poetry. They're an older generation. I mean, I'm not making any pronouncements. Well, I think you can still do the other. I mean, I have to be on the internet a lot, and a lot of projects in publishing and editing and putting together Naropa, because I'm not in Boulder, and this is our world, and I'm grateful for that access. And people speak on the phone less. So I always think of Frank O'Hara's this notion of the immediacy of the phone call, and I tend to call, still call. I guess you can still get together. I mean, what I worry about is not getting together in these ways where you actually go maybe in school you do this. You're in laboratories with other students and you're working on things together and doing projects together. I don't know. I mean, I certainly travel in places where that's happening. And I also meet people who are more Luddite, and they're off the grid, and they're growing they're doing gardening and this and that, and all kinds of secret projects to really, have this revolution of consciousness, I mean, it's a really hard time, really crazy time, and we're very endangered, I think. So doing things that are that really prioritize this kind of communal activity. And I mean, do you feel you get together with people less and you're on the computer more? Or, there was the Berkeley Poetry Conference in '65 that I went to, and it was Allen Ginsberg and Charles Olson who was going to be king of the raft. And I think they both came out, pretty unscathed. I mean, Olson came apart on stage, not letting people, Robert Duncan raising his hand he'd be allowed to go pee. He was just holding people in thralls. He departed from the poem and just began speaking, and then amazed that, that we could be in this state, and this was it was amazing sort of occurrence and intervention. And Alan, I think, handled things very differently. But there was, I think, conversation had begun in Vancouver, so there were these historic meetings of these various figures. Spicer was very opposed to the Beats, and there was a coterie around him that was almost boycotting. But that started shifting, I think, as younger people became. I mean, Spicer is as much part of my landscape as Alan and others. I mean, I didn't know him, but the work is very important. And then who got into anthologies seemed to be, issues. But there was still the resistance. There was I think, a spirit of resistance to the other stuff, to the official verse culture reality. So that was the point. The new American poetry was the experimental, outrider, more risky, non-closure, all those things I was saying that are shared. All these, this list of kind of New York school tropes is actually expansive. I think now, I mean, I'm in touch with like Lynn Haginian. Just today we were talking about something, trying to do, I mean, she does this Poets in Need, people need things. We work together on the Academy, just trying to move things forward in terms of, social attention to various needs and trying to expand the Academy to include poetry from other countries and just be more open. It's the Academy of American Poets, and translation is of course an issue. I'm going to be in China with Elliot Weinberger, and this is something he harps on, how there's so little, there just isn't enough translation. We're going to be talking about conversations with poets who will be there from Palestine and other places to have more contact. There is contact from the through being online and so on, but having really getting together, meeting with people, and figuring out ways to respond to the darkness time. But I would say, I don't feel that kind of competition. We found in Europa, in a way, it was handy that it was starting in Boulder because it was this meeting place, and so we were getting poets from both coasts and beyond, and on this rocky mountain spine, and very dramatic. We're very near the Continental Divide, so for me this was an image of this kind of space that would be a place where we would join sort of forces. And I think that's continued. And Alan, of course, was back and forth and in all these scenes, and a real communicator and activist in that way. And Barbara Guest moved out to California towards the end of her life, and there were many young poets from that scene, or third generation, second generation language, and of course language poetry really was very strong. The birth of a lot of those things was out there, and you had Charles in the East Coast, but it's bi-coastal always. The idea of indeterminacy, that you work with where you are, and you're I mean, I've seen Rudy in action, and he seemed very intentional. There was an intentional thing, but he was that kind of eye that can just see. Or being with Joe Brainerd, walking down the street and just picking up trash. A little wrapper, a candy wrapper that was gold or silver, or had some image on it or color that would just. So you had the visual people with that kind of sense perception, and letting it all come in. And I guess I mean, I think of Edwin was more, very fastidious in those sonnets, as you know. And I think in working more out of a formal sense of the sonnet. But again, they're very visual. And then there's the wonderful Mediterranean cities with Rudy's photos, and there's a real exchange there, give and take. I mean, you probably know more of how that was accomplished, whether one came before the other specifically. Was he writing just off the...
I think they were actually composed
separately.
They
traveled
together
to those places. Yeah,
experience.
exactly. No, there's so many different examples, and I tried, the walking around thing, and the I would say in the case of Bernadette, again a kind of stream of consciousness in a way, and then very deliberate strategies and playing with other text and lists and investigative poetics in a way, but used in a different form. Not to do research to tell you about some particular subject, but to use the vocabulary of some other reality, that kind of thing. And even Kathy Acker, who's coming off Burroughs to some extent, but also and she was around the Poetry Project, some of those strategies of cut up and appropriation, and then taking texts that have plot and narrative and screwing with them in a great refreshed way. When she read it in Europa this last summer, it was a poem on secondhand stores, and going shopping and for clothes. It was very particular, real, out of experience, but also very playful and funny. Well, investigative poetics that term came from, sort of officially from Ed Sanders, a lecture he gave at Nova, where you actually do research, you do this saturation job on a particular subject, and in his case, he's looking at history. I mean, I read with him the other night, he's very involved with the assassination of Robert Kennedy. These poems are about a kind of narrative with all these as yet revealed facts that come out of his research. It's kind of chilling and interesting, but Ginsberg's poem on Plutonian Ode, for example, involves research, but also a sort of litany to these various deities and bringing in kind of mantra and so on in a sort of Vedic voice, as his Pentagon poem, where he's trying to bring down the Pentagon and ends with mantra. And that was interesting to me, that you could bring mantra into sort of political activism. And so that manic voice in his, is very, and then with Kenneth Koch, something like Sleeping with Women, Asleep and Sleeping with Him, this wonderful anaphoric list has a totally different quality. But I was trying to say that some of the methods could be the same, or some of the resonances, but with very different results. And I just saw her Horses concert, which was very powerful. It's interesting to me that those poems, if you think of them as texts, can have this ongoing life. And again, in that case, again, this sort of Vedic life through a performance. The artist would do the work and then often give it to you to help you support the publication and so on. So I'd be going by for something like that, and then we'd look at various possibilities. He would have had something in mind, and then there'd often be three choices. One of the first things that we did with Angel Hair, Louis Warsh and myself, was a book by Lee Harwood. And Joe had a number of, possible covers. And we picked one that was somewhat simpler. It was mainly, maybe we had consulted with Lee, but it was called The Man with Blue Eyes, and it was a kind of love poems for John Ashbery. It was, a very beautiful book. He recently passed away, a British poet. So we got the drawing from Joe, and I was getting to know Joe, but we printed it on this beautiful blue Fabriano paper. Of course, it was supposed to be on white paper. So Joe was very nice about it. And but in the case of a Jim Rosenquist project with a book called Dreams by Peter Sheldall, they weren't happy with the cover. So that was quite expensive. It was a full color, operation. And then there was also, I think, a Donna Dennis cover for something that also had to be redone. Kenward Elmsley's Girl Machine, somehow, which is a wonderful performative poem that's off Busby Berkeley sort of That's with Busby Berkeley, girl machine, and there was some problem with because there was so much repetition, some of the pages got out of order. So that had to be redone. So there were often, but it was very, very playful. So you'd go in and then there'd be, some Arches paper or some sort of paper, something in progress that you could engage in and upon. And then there were, particular events coming up where you wanted to get something together for a particular reading or event. It was social, it was easier. And, recent things are put together by a public, like the Tanya Grossman and Bill Goldson's, what's it called, the Universal, this is very high-end stuff. And I remember working with Elizabeth Murray. I was picked up at the airport, went out there. They had 3 people handing us pencils to sign. Our names were in the watermark, and it was going to sell for, $40,000. It's just a very different economics, so to speak. George Schneeman lived practically next door to me on St. Mark's Place, and so you would walk in there, you'd work, and then you'd have dinner, a wonderful, family environment. Conversation would come into the work. Sometimes I'd go with a couple of notes, and he'd again have things that he had cut out of magazines. And then I remember being in India and bringing him back some images from children's books in India, and him, and that led to, a number of works. So that kind of much more easy exchange. And yes, economics is huge. And I see so many younger people on travels, and I went to Detroit because I've been telling students, if you really have if you're really strong and you have some strong feeling about, reclamation and going to a new place and some kind of environment where you could really make a difference and get some things going, that would be a place to go. And when I went there, they were offering me a house, and they said you have to live here full time, which I can't do. But something like that. I think it's it's time to think outside these sort of structures, economic and otherwise. And if you are a kind of maverick person and a pioneer, this would be what I would recommend. Going into places that are economically depressed, help bring things back. Of course, the whole thing can then get gentrified, and another thing, can turn into something that you don't necessarily want it to be. But there's still plenty of places, I think, to work that I see. So yeah, the cities are. I can't not live some of the time, most of the time in New York, or be based here for the time being. It's important to some kind of my metabolism. Yes, but.
We're glad you're here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.